A few sessions ago, we talked about frames per second, FPS. We didn't really know how to measure the actual frames per second that our application is loading. That's exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to create together an FPS monitor that is going to help you monitor your application and see if it's actually working to the spec that you want it to work. So let's see it in action. This section is going to be incredibly fun, a bit long, but fun things sometimes take a while to explain. We're going to create together an FPS counter that will let us know basically how well is our application performing. How long does it take for items to refresh on the screen? So let's jump right into it, and you'll see that in our sample we've added an FPS element, and I want to show you what we added in. So I added a div layer which has an ID called FPS, and in the bottom of my body I've added the script fps.js. Now, in the script itself, when you open it up, it's going to be completely filled out, so feel free to delete it and start from scratch with me. Now, even before starting our sample, I want to go through the things that we're going to need. So the first thing that I'm going to need is I'm going to need access. I'm going to just create those variables really quickly. I'm going to need access to that FPS div that we've created in our HTML. The next thing that I want to do is, I'm just going to go ahead here and explain the idea behind here. I want to animate something and then basically always have it animating so I can then check and see how often does it get refreshed, how often does it change. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and create a new acolors, and what I really want to do is I'm going to go to this background and just have it fade in and out to do different colors, making sure that I'm always doing some sort of an animation. I could have, if I wanted to, put it outside of the area of my screen or created an animation that is so subtle that the user wouldn't notice it too much, such as going from blue to another shade of blue, which could be very fun. But usually you would put an FPS whenever the user is not really there, so it doesn't really matter. You usually would probably drop this FPS in a real application. So I'm going to go ahead and just set those colors, and I'm just going to paste here a few colors that I pre-configured earlier. So we're going to go ahead and just put there, and what I'm going to do is animate between those two colors sequentially, each time this color and then that color. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set a counter that's going to count how many times was the screen refreshed in general since our application begun. Another value that I'm going to want is I'm going to want the last value of our animation so I could then see if a change has happened. Last but not least, I want to also set the time parameter so I know what time was it between each section. Now, one thing that I want to make sure, what I want to talk about here really quickly is new date exists and is very commonly used, but it's not very efficient when it comes down to things that are very, very accurate. A much better performance measure is a module that's called window.performance.now, which will actually return to us the value that is currently in time since the browser has refreshed. Basically, in other words, it's going to basically give us the actual time that passed since the application begun, really, since the document completed loaded. Now, we could call this anytime we want to without needing to instantiate anything, because that is happening always. Now, not every browser supports it, so what we're doing here right now is quite modern, and you'll have to make sure that if it doesn't work on your browser, it's probably because that specific browser doesn't support that. So, but we're not concerned by that. We're kind of cutting edge right now, and this is really just a research tool, so we're not going to have it run all the time. We're only having it run when we're testing it out on the browsers that we're supporting. Alright, so now that we've done with those intros, it's time for us to start an animation. So I'm going to go ahead for my FPS and I want to animate it. And literally all I'm going to do is I'm going to select the property of background color. And what I want to do is I want to animate the acolors position 0 because that's our first animation. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set how long do I want that animation to take place, which is 1 second. And last but not least, I also want to have a callback that will be called whenever animation completes. So I'm going to call that on FPS animation done. Oh, anim done. Let's do it anim done. All right. So that's it. That's all we really had to do from the animation perspective. All that's left for us to do is also make sure that we have that function actually defined. And once our function is defined, we can now start manipulating and deciding what do we want to do next. What I really want to do is I want my animation to always go on and always continue. Now in this case, if I just run my application once, it's going to basically fade our item from whatever position it's in. Oh, and I must have here a little typo. So let me open up my inspector and look into my console to see, am I getting any information? So first of all, I'm seeing A colors is not defined. So let me go ahead and make sure that A color and not A colors, right? So I could go ahead here and or change it to A colors to make sure that that should work. And let me just run this one more time. And we'll see that our item fades out. It takes it 1 second. Beautiful. What we really want to do is have it flip between colored, not colored, colored, not colored. And to do that, what I want to do is I want to pass a parameter through my div layer. I want to basically use a jQuery command that enables me to save some information that will relate to that specific FPS. I could, if I want, create here a toggle variable as well, but it's good for our practice and for you guys to see other ways to treat data, especially if you had a lot of things going on at the same time. But really, technically, I could have just created here a variable and have it toggle between true and false and change the direction, or between 0 and 1. Now, the next step, what I really want to do is I'm going to go ahead and check to see what is our index. And what we're really going to do is we're going to use a property of jQuery that is called data. And with data, what I could do is basically or fetch information variables or set them based on a specific div. So it's basically information that is stored that is related to a specific div. In this case, it's not set, so it wouldn't be equal 1. And in that case, I'm going to want to get the value 0 or 1. So again, so in this case, if the value does not equal 1, then we're going to make it 1. If the value does equal 1, then we're going to turn it into 0. Now, once I got this value inside of my index, all that's left for me to do, and by the way, this is a ternary operator. We haven't seen this before, but I don't think I've showed it in this video segment. But basically, this means if this value is true, then return this. If not, return that. And in this case, we're passing the value. If this value equals 1, then I'm going to, if this is not 1, or if it is 1, we're going to pass 0 to our index. If the value is not, then we will pass 1. All right, well, that makes sense. The next step that I want to do is I want to go into that FPS data, and I want to basically set that index to that new value that it is. Now, I'm not too concerned about making my code overly optimized because I really want to help showcase also the speed of our FPS. So for my account, I don't mind that I'm adding a little bit more lag, but in a real application, I probably want to modify and improve based on all the things that we've talked about previously, such as, optimizing it by setting a variable instead of approaching an object each time and calling a function each time. So if we have only 1 FPS, and that is the case, it would be a lot more efficient if we were working with a local variable instead of calling a method 2 times. All right, but I'm going to ignore that, and I'm going to go ahead into my FPS and animate it again. Literally, what I'm going to do is just grab this function call that we had in our initial beginning, and once I have that, basically go ahead here and change just one property, which is what are we animating. And in this case, what we're animating is going to be our A colors, and we want to animate the position index. So it's going to each time toggle between 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. If I go ahead here, we should create an endless loop of animations where this animation should basically animate out, animate in, animate out, animate in, unless we have here a little error here, and we can see here that maximum call stack size exceeded, which basically means we must have here an endless loop here that we've created without noticing. So let's take a deeper look at this to try to understand what have we done incorrectly. So just taking a deeper look at here, first of all, this seems just about right, but the problem here is that we're referring to ourselves. So I'm basically I'm going into A colors, which is really, I don't want to do that. All I really wanted to do is just get to A colors index. I, by mistake, created a double call. So really, that's all I really wanted because that's the index I needed. So I just wanted to replace that 0 with the index. So I'll go ahead here and save that. Go back and click refresh one more time, and we should see that now it's going to fade in and fade out endlessly. Now that we have an animation that is constant, that we could talk to all the time, that we know that it's always moving, it's time for us to test and see how often does this animation actually get updated. And to do that, we're going to take advantage of that performance now that we were looking at earlier. And really what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a set interval that's going to run forever, so I don't even need a variable for it. So I'm going to just send inside a function inside, and I'm going to have it run really quickly, once every 10 milliseconds. Now, inside of the set interval that I've created, what I really want to do is I want to check to see if the last value, which is not set initially, which is fine, if it's not exactly equal to our FPS CSS background color, then what do we want to do? If it doesn't equal it exactly, then we want to basically make sure that we're going to update our count. So I'm going to go ahead to my count and I'm going to update our count. Now, only if it doesn't equal it, then we're going to change it. But also one thing that we want to do immediately is we also want to go to that last val, and we're going to go to that last val, and we're going to go ahead and set that value into it. And again, we want to be a little bit better performing, so let's create here FPS val and just set here just the value. That way we're not calling a method twice without a reason, and I could just compare between two local variables, a lot more efficient, and then set that variable into that last val, basically saying if it's not the same, then okay, make it the same and just update the count. That means there was a change in our view. The next step that I want to do is I also want to count how much time passed since the beginning of time. In our case, the beginning of time was the actual time that we had up here. So I'm just going to go ahead here and just create one more variable that we're going to want to use, and I'm going to call it since start. And I'm going to go ahead here, now that I have that variable, and calculate how much time passed. So to do that, I'm going to go to my window, performance, now, and I'm going to subtract the time, the original time that this application started. Now I'm going to create an FPS that is a little bit different, and I encourage you to create an FPS of your own that is better. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have an FPS that is continuous. And the idea behind this is also to see how our performance is going on over time and how it affects us over time. Are we growing in our number? Are we going down in our number? And if I'll go ahead here and I'm going to go to my FPS text, and I'm just going to write out basically the value of how many refreshes a minute, or how many refreshes a minute are there. So I'm going to take 1 minute and divide it based on with the actual time in average it takes us to create a refresh. So we know how much time passed. Okay, so that's the first property. That's a value that's going to be in seconds. So I'm going to basically divide it by the amount of times that this count has been growing. Now this count is going to grow forever. We're never really resetting it until we decide that we want to make a reset. But for now, we're not going to create a reset. We're just going to create the sample. And this is really all the code that we need to create a FPS counter that is incredibly intelligent. And if we go ahead and click on our refresh, we'll see that every time that it has a chance to, it's going to go ahead and update the frame rate. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that in average, our average is going up over time. We're going 57, 56 until it's going to find that balance where in average, our frames per second is basically between 56 and 57 frames per second. And you see that it's continually growing, which means once we're stabilizing and we're not really doing that many things really, we're only doing things whenever we have to, we built a really efficient application, we're seeing that we're not having a memory leak. And a wonderful way to test if you have a real problem of a memory leak is just letting this run for an hour and seeing if it crashes, or even better than that, seeing if your average changes drastically. In our case, we're seeing that we're running on 58 frames per second. If we walk away and come back in 20 minutes, we expect it to stay in that range or hopefully better. Now, I'm going to go ahead into our bad sample, and I want you to see what happens in our bad sample contrary to that. So we're starting in our bad sample, and first of all, in our bad sample, I already was starting from 21 frames per second. If I'm going to go ahead here and just save this, oopsie. All right, after a little bit of testing, I forgot that in our bad sample, the reason why the bad sample is not working is because we're trying to animate the background, which is a property that belongs only to jQuery UI. So I'm going to go ahead into my bad example and make sure that I'm incorporating also jQuery UI. Now that I have jQuery UI in it, I could also test out our bad sample, and I want you to notice something very interesting. Although in the beginning we're struggling to find our frame rate like we were in our good example, while in our good example, every single round, every few minutes, our time went up a bit. It was balancing up, going up. But here we're seeing a struggle between 50 to 51, and now you see 50 doesn't exist anymore. And notice where these numbers, you see how the values are slowly getting lower. What I'm going to do now is just pause the video for a second and return in a few minutes. And we'll see where the frame rate is going to be then. So as you can see, we're back, and our frame rate is slowly getting lower and lower and lower. Although this frame rate is wonderful still, it's very concerning. It's very concerning when you see something changing so drastically. It was just been a few minutes, and in these few minutes, our time went down to 49 frames per second, and soon it's going to go down even further. And don't forget, this is an average. That means our current frame rate might be a lot less than that. We're averaging from the actual beginning of our application. So this is a very concerning trend, and that means that there's a lot of problems in our code. Now, if you let it run for an hour or less even, the application will crash, because we have a lot of issues in our code in our bad example. But we're not going to worry about the bad example, because in our good example, we're going to see that our good example might start weaker, but you're going to see that it's going to stabilize. Once it finds that stabilization point, we're going already across to 52 and 53 and 54, and it's finding that balance. Once it finds that balance, you'll see that if we're sitting on it for quite a while, it's going to grow until it finds its right position. But once it gets to there, unless there's something major going on in our application that's going to slow us down, which there isn't, our application is just to continuously get faster and faster and faster, or stabilize on a certain speed once it gets to that limit of how fast it could render things. And that's around that, you can see it's around that 56, where it's kind of like struggling to figure out where could it be, 56.27 in my case, but it's still climbing up. Now, that's exactly what you want to see in your application. You want to see that it's not going down. You want to see that your frame rate is not getting worse over time, because if it does, that's a very good sign that something is horribly wrong in your application. So that's it. That's it for this lecture, and it was a really important one and a very long one. And go ahead and modify it to your code and start using this FPS counter that we've created together to make sure that you could test out your applications and see, especially applications that have a lot of things going on in them, to see how well are they performing. So I'll see you in the next lecture.